about Grace, Joe and mission-oriented government. Just to give you a sense of what's ahead in the next hour, we're first going to have a fairly informal conversation between Grace and Joe and myself, answering that kind of essay question set in the webinar title around the impact of mission-oriented government on the civil service. I think if we look back to a year ago, I certainly observed a sense of anticipation, perhaps sort of energy around the fact that after years of political instability and in many cases policy stasis, we had a government with a majority that was talking quite interestingly about a new way of doing government, a mission-based way, which many of us were already familiar with. And I think the anticipation was summed up for me, a webinar we ran just before the election in which former Permanent Secretary Jonathan Slater said, "We don't quite know how the mission narrative will play out if Labour gets into power, but we do know that working collaboratively towards long-term outcomes is the most satisfying way that civil servants can be working, and it is how we should be working." So he encouraged listeners in the civil service to kind of lean into the opportunity for change that would be presented, could have been presented by a mission-oriented government. I think without spoiling our discussion too much, it's harder to find that sense of energy and anticipation a year on in the government. But our aim today is to explore a little bit why we might be feeling a bit more deflated a year on, and also look for signs of where we can still see something interesting, some signs of optimism, some reasons to still lean into moments of change in public service and policy reform. So we'll have that discussion. There will also be time at the end for questions. So I do encourage you to use the chat function on the right of the screen to put in your questions for Grace, Joe, myself, something we're saying that you want to hear more on, or something we're not saying that you would like to us to try and answer. I will pick them up during the discussion if they kind of seem really relevant to a point we're making, and I will try and get through as many as possible at the end. So without enough of my voice, let's find out a little bit more about Grace and Joe and why they are interested in mission-based government. So Joe, can I ask you to go first and tell us how you came to be kind of researching and talking and writing about how to make government better?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Susanna. So most of my career before this job was as a civil servant, mostly in the Home Office and the Treasury and kind of other big central government departments. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to sort of research and write about it full time now. But I got into this gig because I thought, you know, that the way government works is so hard to understand from the outside and also pretty hard to understand from the inside at times. But it really matters. You know, it's never going to be the number one news item on at the top of the hour. But in the long run, issues of how well the state works and the times when it doesn't hugely matter to everyone in the public. And so it's incumbent on those of us who care about it, research about it and write about it to find ways to make that more persuasive, more impactful and to change things as well. You know, this is an area where lots of the problems are 100-year plus long running problems, and the solutions we've tried have not really worked, and we need a new level of creativity. So it's a very exciting time.
Thanks, Joe. And what about you, Grace? Tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be on a panel about mission-based government.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, so I'm Grace. As you said, I work at the Future Governance Forum. Worth just saying, we're a relatively new think tank coming up to sort of 2 years this autumn, and we're focused on the reform to how we do government, straddling both the kind of official and the political. My background is not in the civil service. I came to this work through kind of social research and working kind of strategies for social change. So mainly working in civil society with a sort of interest and experience in sort of bringing partners together across government, industry and civil society to kind of drive transformational change beyond campaigning or lobbying, which have of course have a place, traditional campaigning methods, but really interested in kind of that more, as Joe said, that more creative kind of approach to tackling problems collaboratively. So yeah, that's sort of how I came to this work.
Lovely, thank you. I love when we have different perspectives on a panel because I think it gives a much more rich and helpful discussion. Before we sort of dive deeper in, I wanted to start by thinking about, do we need to differentiate between sort of a mission-based government and the missions, the kind of 5 missions? And I think you can have quite different conversations around, the success of the mission's progress around them versus mission-based government. So I wanted to just get your thoughts on, can you distinguish between them? Should we distinguish between them? And kind of set some sort of rules for ourselves around how we're thinking about those. Grace, you nodded enthusiastically, so I'm going to pick on you to go first.
Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. We have to distinguish between them. Mission-driven government or mission-oriented government is the how rather than the what. And the 5 missions that this government at this moment in time has chosen are their chosen North Stars. Previous governments have had theirs. You could argue that levelling up was a kind of mission. The GLA, GMCA, many councils, combined authorities, they have their own that might align with the current national missions. So missions, like however they're chosen and defined, are a mechanism for working in a different way. And mission-driven government as a practice, which is therefore more than a kind of signal of intent for campaigning or kind of communicating. Although I'm interested in coming back to the kind of communication with the electorate and the sort of storytelling that mission-driven government entails. But in short, like mission-driven government is a kind of a practice that's much more than a signal of intent. It's a banner for thinking about clarity of purpose, focus on outcomes, emphasis on partnership working, license to innovate and experiment, all those sorts of things, which I'm sure we'll get into. It's a way of, I guess, one additional thought just at this point is it's kind of, there can't and shouldn't be a blueprint across those 5 missions for how they're achieved. The point of missions is that they set a really clear and audacious end state, but leave open with a kind of humility the possibilities of how we'll get there. So it sort of doesn't work to think about them as all being all having the same tactics or approaches. So they're kind of creative, but also really thorough at the same time, because they're a way of a forcing mechanism of thinking beyond traditional policy priorities, which are of course vital, but it might open up or clarify areas that we've been neglecting that could actually really shift the dial towards those goals. Tons more to say about mission-driven government as a practice, but I'll stop there. Do
you want to come in, Joe?
Yeah, sure. I think the distinction is helpful and is really important. And I won't echo all of the things that Grace just said on what people mean by mission-driven government as a kind of philosophy of how to run the state. I think there are kind of elements of it which are re-articulating actually best practice about how to get big challenging things done in government that we've known for a while. And there are other elements of it which are a bit less tried and tested, and we're going to see whether the government's approach can kind of bear them out or not. But I think that maybe the helpful kind of addition and distinction I'd make is that the kind of the 5 missions themselves will make or break whether mission-driven government feels like a kind of success to people. If in 4 years' time, the government have spent a lot of time talking and thinking about how to do mission-driven government, but none of their 5 missions they seem to have made substantial progress on, then I suspect, I don't think the public really notice these things either way, but kind of people in Westminster won't feel that it's been a success as a philosophy, and they'll probably be right about that. So, the most important thing about this is, it's great if it resets how government thinks about delivering public services, but if that doesn't result in big step changes in big problems, then I think it will probably be seen as a failure, and that's really the test.
That's really interesting, because I think for me, observing the 5 missions, I feel that they're the thing that has been it's been too easy for people to absorb them into normal ways of working. If you think about the mission boards, the structure of SROs, all the missions sit within one department. They didn't have any kind of mission-based spending allocations in the spending review. It feels like the 5 missions have just assimilated into normal ways of working. So that's really interesting, Joe, that we do need to make sure that progress is made on those, as well as trying to change ways of working and across other bits of government. You've listed some of them already, Grace, around a clarity on focus, a clarity of focus on outcomes, working in partnership, and permitting innovation. Are there any other things that we kind of generally mean or talk about when we think about mission-driven government in the kind of broadest sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I just had a bit of feedback, which was distracting. Sorry. Yes. I think first thing to say is like the point of missions, or the like meta mission, is that they're about kind of growing the economy in a direction equitably, sustainably, securely. So like direction, not just trend. And they're also a method for reforming public services. I think a third part is, leads on from what Joe was saying, is that they're a way of restoring and kind of restoring trust amongst the public in government, which we know is at sort of worryingly low levels, by promoting that kind of collective endeavour across society. I think one of the like freeing things I think about missions is that government can't achieve these on their own, and national government needs to work really collaboratively to orchestrate across a kind of wider network of devolved regional, local government, businesses, civil society, communities, people directly. So that's one aspect of it. I think collaboration, that's the ambition. I think the first step is collaboration across departments. I think one of the things I find frustrating is talk of mission departments, which just like runs counter to the whole idea that they should sit above departments. And I think there was really good intention for them to, sit above departmental silos, but they've just snapped back into those kind of traditional accountability lines. And then all of the other engagement mirrors that. In a way, civil society has set itself up to mirror the departmental silos rather than thinking about kind of cross-cutting issues. I think the last thing I'll say just at this point is that missions are also a mechanism to think more expansively about capabilities that we need in government to be able to work in this way. Relational practice, test, learn, grow. It's not just a cabinet office program. I think it's about a culture across, it's drawing on and learning from a culture across local and regional government. And it's opening up it's about opening up a different way of working in partnership. And I think that makes for more interesting work. To your point, to your quoting of Jonathan Powell, it makes for more interesting to work in that way. I think the way that we think about missions is that they're about like leading with purpose and governing in partnership. And I almost see that as a way of kind of this is me slightly thinking aloud, but shaking up the idea of like big state and small state, because in a really blunt way, like the big state in the sense that the state should be really purposeful and directional, but small in the sense of like the humility of knowing that significant change comes from that collaborative effort beyond government. The missions will be achieved by people in their communities as much as they will be achieved by civil servants.
Joe, could I ask you to, is there anything that we would add to that in terms of what we know about Labour's approach to the missions, or kind of acknowledging that missions are less spoken about by some ministers still do, of course. But when we hear Starmer talking about public service reform now, it's rewiring the state. So what else do we kind of know and understand about Labour's approach to missions or public service reform?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in that. And I could say it's a really good provocation. I'll say quickly about maybe the government's kind of language over the last few months and how it's evolved. I think it's really interesting. And it's a good example of why, perennially kind of governments try and deliver big things, and then events happen to them and the world changes. And, the idea of these big long-term efforts gets thrown into challenge, which is exactly the kind of risk, right? And, the government came into power with missions it had set about a year in advance of that. Increasingly, politics and public service challenges are being dominated by things, some of which are missions and some of which aren't missions. Notably, sluggish economic growth is a key kind of mission, although it's one where we could absolutely nail the commitment to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 and still not really have grown at all, because G7 economic growth has been terrible over the last few years. And if that pattern continues, we could hit the target and miss the point. But then other things which are not missions at all, right? Defense and national security kind of growing issue in the public consciousness, but a really big, serious issue, I think, is one of the government's 3 foundations or something like that, as is immigration, which is, continues to be possibly the kind of top 1 or 2 political issue. The government have got some really tricky choices to make, but the more those choices drive them in the direction of things which aren't the missions, the more challenging that story becomes. I wonder if I can just quickly bridge from that into what I think the kind of meta challenge going on here is, which is, the big risk for this kind of mission driven government theory is that it becomes everything to everyone and then is kind of nothing, right? The 5 missions as defined cover like 80% plus of public spending. If we think in a world of kind of limited resources, saying those are your priorities, like in some sense misses what a priority is. Now, that's a bit of an unfair criticism because within those big chunks of what the government does, the government have said, we care about this thing more than this thing. They care about elective targets in the NHS more than they care about A&E. And that's genuine choice making, which is really good. But, the more their effort becomes the missions and these other things which aren't missions, which are really important, and a new public service reform line around fixing a state, which the Prime Minister said had kind of become bigger but weaker, the more diluted it all becomes. So that's really tricky. And then I guess the most interesting thing about these kind of theories is like, why have they... Lots of these ideas have been around for a long time. We've talked about more joined up thinking and working across departmental silos since long before I was a civil servant. We're talking about it long after I'm dead, probably. Why has that never really worked? And what's the mission-driven government analysis of that? I still don't quite know that we figured out the real problems there. And on the flip side, when's it not true? Like, a lot of the language around mission-driven government is about collaboration, about join up, about bringing everyone into the process. But some of the biggest missions that have ever historically been delivered in this country and the world actually were about like ruthless focus, taking things out of processes, not listening to all of the stakeholders and just cracking on. If you think about the vaccine task force during the pandemic, or actually even, rapid testing, if you think about the Apollo program in the US and moon landings, or initiatives like DARPA, these are all getting at something which we use as part of evidence in the mission-driven government theories. But actually, I think if you ask people who are involved in that, they would be hard-pressed to say, we actually really involved communities from the ground up. We brought all of the stakeholders on board and consulted them at length over a long period of time. Actually, those missions weren't about that. They were about really fast delivery of big challenges, iterating quickly and solving problems and just getting on with it.
I think you've lots of interesting points we can pick up on there. The two that I want to sort of steer towards is the kind of sense of what's changed and what hasn't in the last year. And I think to your point around these could be so broad, but actually they have made some choices of priorities. My sense is that in some of the mission areas, the last year has been about trying to define, okay, well, how do we kind of actually agree on the priority and we've got our target, but how do we make that something of a reality and something that's goes beyond kind of motherhood and apple pie was the phrase that Susan Ackland Hood used at the Restate conference. She said, we all agree that we want children to have a good start to life. But how do we put that into something tangible? And so I think there probably has been work going on that it's been hard to observe from the outside. But also to your point, Joe, around they've been buffeted by events, dear boy. Surely that kind of points to the need to have mechanisms around mission-driven work in which it starts to have a momentum of its own. I've heard Georgia Gold talking about she knew the missions in Camden. So she's now in the Cabinet Office. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows this, but my journalistic instinct is to explain that she is now a minister in the Cabinet Office, but she is famous in public policy terms for leading a mission-driven approach in Camden Council when she was leader of that council. And she said, I knew it was working when things started to happen around our missions that we had not started. So people, businesses or, other community groups would start something that drove towards one of the Camden's goals, but it wasn't instigated by the council. So I'm interested around that kind of what has changed. This is my next question is, do we see tangible impacts or differences that we can attribute to a mission-driven approach to government or the Labour administration? And kind of as a sub-question with that, do you see the kind of signs of structures or programs around these that could start to build momentum, because we're never going to see number 10 able to focus only on the missions for the next 4 years. Sorry, that's a really big question for both of you. You can pick which to go on. Grace, do you want to go first on what tangible impacts have you observed watching and speaking to civil servants over the last year?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to come back on some of Joe's points, at the risk of like just violently agreeing with everything that you say, Joe, but I completely agree that like if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And I think there is a risk of seeing the missions as a kind of trade-off with the immediate crisis cycle. We always sort of said ahead of the election, there is a real risk that these get deprioritized. The Prime Minister is not going to have much time to think about these week to week, and you have to protect that and not see those as kind of like, given how much has changed globally since the election, that is not that's reason to rethink the missions. That's reason to like actually I think double down on them, but it's not reason to kind of see them as trade-off. I think actually crisis can kind of focus the mind. Camden were prompted by COVID in delivering mission-driven government as that kind of like wartime approach in peacetime, like kind of mentality. I think the real barrier to this, I promise I will come back to your question, is thinking about incentive mechanisms across different tiers of government. And I think we need much more honest conversations about the kind of real grit of collaboration. This is not about pointing fingers at like why certain departments aren't doing certain things. So for instance, I would say that the climate mission is probably the most advanced in terms of its architecture and its progress as a sort of single point of contact for business and the outside world to kind of engage. But I just saw a little emoji of celebration, someone from working on that mission. But I think what's indicative of that is it's kind of held by a single department as far as I know, and getting other departments that, of course, business and DEFRA, all sorts of other transport are going to be crucial to achieving that mission. Education in terms of the skills agenda, and how you incentivize departments to work on something that's not ultimately their top priority feels like a real barrier to the kind of cross departmental working that we have been trying to achieve for long since before I was born and long since after I die, as Joe said. Sorry, that was a bit of a mix of a like positive and more constructive, but I can come back on other. It'd be really good to talk about the Test and Learn programme, because I do think that is probably the most clear mission-driven programme from my perspective, and the wider public service reform agenda.
Yeah, Test and Learn, and I think sort of aligned with that, the mission test beds that were announced just after the spending review. But we can pick those up. Joe, what about from you? What has changed? Has anything changed?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a bit, not much. If I was doing, score out of 10, I'd say like, 7 for effort and 4 for outcome or something like that. I think, mission boards seem to largely resemble cabinet committees, of which we have had many over the years in different iterations, and will continue to have them for a long time, I imagine. And I actually think it's a mistake to look for like the change or the difference at that kind of big macro level. To some extent, we're just talking about like the same few dozen people meeting in different kinds of rooms in different bits of SW1. Like, I think that we oversubscribe change at that level. I think the Test and Learn initiative's very early stage, but yeah, absolutely, Grace is right, could be really interesting. The kind of the test of the Test and Learn, the sort of meta thing here, right, it is whether they're really allowed to do it, right, and to do it, and also to move it beyond scale. Government has tested and learned lots of things in pilots, in place-based areas over the years. The question with this stuff is always scale, which is where government falls down. Is like, you get loads and loads of interest in doing a pilot. Pilots are kind of fun and easy to do. They're easier to announce, and they're a great kind of career thing for civil servants to be involved in. But we never really continue them. We never do anything with what we learn. We never encounter the hard choices of like, if we were to start doing this more, we'd have to do something else less now. And so I think that's the really big test for the kind of Test and Learn team. I think the other way we'll see whether things have changed. There are two. One is policy. And actually, I don't think that the mission-driven approach is driving more policy coherence in the government's agenda. radical focus wouldn't be characterized by the same profound internal contradictions that we see in quite a lot of government policy. It's simultaneously true that the government is really feeling the economic and fiscal pressure. It kind of every week there are more challenging stories about it. At the same time, is pursuing a kind of employment and workers' rights package, which is likely to be hugely damaging for the economy, and for businesses, which is already lumped significant taxes on top of which are new. So that would be an area where growth being the kind of big mission doesn't seem to be feeding through into real trade-offs between policies. I think I'm not an energy specialist, but on Grace's point about energy, there's a kind of, it's probably the mission with the clearest kind of strategy around it. Maybe health after the 10-year plan also has a bit more of that kind of story and narrative about what they're doing. But again, do I think that's actually kind of biting and meshing with the energy policy? Like, probably not. I mean, we continue to, the government continues to say it won't pursue things which would be net very good for their own energy goals, like regional or zonal pricing in energy, which it's recently said it will climb down on doing and won't do. And we keep announcing that we're fast tracking nuclear power, but never actually fast track nuclear power. So again, it's easy for government to publish PDFs on gov.uk. It's quite hard for those to translate through actions. And I think it's a bit of a wait and see.
Yeah, if I could bring into, there is a question, because you mentioned mission boards, and this question that's come in, which I think is interesting because it also mentions not just boards, but also other mechanisms. So it posits that mission boards don't have specific funding to encourage departmental working, and are they a backward step from past experimentations or innovations? And what I think is interesting is they mention things like the Shared Outcome Fund or the Conflict and Security Stabilisation Fund, I think that's what it stands for, which were shared funds. And I was quite surprised and disappointed that there was nothing in the spending review that, we have a mechanism of shared funds, and we didn't see anything around, I felt like it was just someone had sprayed a Febreze around the top of the spending review and said, this is the missions, this is how it fits in. I wonder if I could get you to reflect on that kind of, have we actually seen a missed opportunity to seize what could have been an existing in positive way of working and squeeze it towards missions? Do you want to go first, Grace? Because you haven't had a chance to chat.
Yeah, I mean, just completely agree with that. And what was interesting about the spending review is there was a real recommitment to the language of missions, and yet there was no evidence of, as far as I could see, that new way of working that Darren Jones sort of signalled at the start of the year. I think it was an IFG conference at which he said that, and there was no kind of evidence that there was anything different from the usual kind of departmental zero-sum game kind of culture. And I think missions will fail to really take hold without Treasury getting fully behind them and fully gripping this as a way of working. I can see Joe wants to come in.
Can I just do it? Because so I think this is an area where we disagree, and I want to give a sort of unpopular counter. I think, what do I think? I think that money being a barrier to good joined up working is true in 20% of the cases where people cite it, and it's not true in 80% of the cases. It's a sort of easy reflexive thing to say when the other challenges are really hard and you want someone else to blame. And look, maybe it's the former Treasury official in me, but I think the Treasury is too often painted as the boogeyman at this. I'll give you one example. When I was at the Treasury, we just well before the mission-driven government language, we reflected on many of the criticisms that were regularly levelled at us on this. And, Rishi Sunak announced this shared outcomes fund. It's very small by total public spending standards, kind of 200 million odd a year, to fund genuine cross-cutting projects. And we said to departments, look, here's a light touch bidding process. We're going to come out. We're going to train you on how to do the bidding process if you want. We're going to talk to you about projects. We were really provocative. I felt like it was the only time as a Treasury official I ever went around departments saying, I want to give you money. Give me ideas that I can give you money for. The number of bids that came in was incredibly low. I remember Kat gave the actual numbers to PAC at one point. The size of the bids that came in was really, really small. We found it very, very hard to spend the fund. And it was a really disappointing experience. And I think that speaks to all kinds of structural barriers. Now, you might say that's because we were trying to do it through the traditional Treasury framework of we set aside a pot and you bid into it. But I genuinely don't know what the alternative is. Maybe I'm unimaginative. I actually think the public finances are an area where in the short term it is zero sum and these things are about trade-offs and everyone else wants to not face up to that. The Treasury are the ones who have to. And if it doesn't come through in a spending review where they clearly made an effort, then I think that tells us something really profound about where the government's actual priorities are.
Can I just come in quickly? It's really, really interesting case study. And I think it kind of highlights the importance of investing proper resource and attention into dynamic capabilities across government, so that when there are those opportunities, the kind of appetite and the experimentation is there to meet that moment. And ultimately I understand the argument that Treasury is an easy way. It's like system change. People will always say you can't do anything until you change the system. You can actually do quite a lot before systems change kicks in. Ultimately it's got to come from the top and from leadership to kind of provide that vision that sits above the missions so that everyone across government. I was really interested in your research yesterday, a sort of lack of people feeling they don't quite know what the primary purpose of their department is, at sort of worryingly high levels. Equally, the wider public need to understand how trade-offs are being made, why trade-offs are being made, to what, to serve what vision. Just a couple of responses.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, Joe, and I have heard both from the kind of Treasury side, this sort of story of, well, we looked at mission-based allocations, and so it became too tricky in the scope of what we had to do. But I've also heard departments who tried to kind of get people to kind of do a joint bid or to kind of put this towards the mission, and it's comes down to willingness from the top, as you say, Grace. Before we sort of I want to make sure we've discussed. Also, I wanted to say in the spending review, what I did think was really positive was the transformation fund and the stuff in there, which shows an indication to kind of investor change. And some of the stuff in there is, early intervention or, interesting stuff, which we will be following at Civil Service World with anticipation. I want to just pick up on the test and learn, which is the other interesting thing that Grace, you mentioned. Joe, you've kind of come in and said, here's where we need to make sure we need to focus on scaling and actually giving permission to have this make an impact rather than just being small. Is there anything else, Grace, you'd add around test and learn that why is it interesting to you, or what do we need to lean into to make it have an impact?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is really strong leadership that gives cover for the new mode of experimentation that we're talking about. If we look at examples of this sort of experimentation in the past, Tell Us Once, for instance, as an example of civil servants across departments working together. I think it took 15 years from first idea to having all councils on board with the Tell Us Once, and not all departments, but all that could be on board with the Tell Us Once service. That wasn't a kind of top-down budget line. That was a bottom-up experimentation. I think we need and again, speaks to your research, Joe, around line management in the civil service, of just really strong leadership that gives cover for that experimentation. Failure is a difficult word when we're talking about public services. Failure, matters. It's real. And understandably, we all want to avoid it. But when something hasn't worked well, navigating that and learning from that requires really strong leadership.
Grace is mentioning the Alternative People Survey, which Restate and CSW ran this year. It was built on a smaller piece of research we did last year around performance management. I'm going to remind the audience that you can put questions in the chat if you have things that you want us to talk about that we are not yet talking about, and also invite you, Joe, to sort of reflect a little bit. People can obviously go to the Restate website or our website and read the findings, but what was interesting to you from that piece of research?
Yeah, and I should say that the Alternative People survey is the first time we're kind of doing this, but yeah, it builds on a survey we had a great response to last year of civil servants. The thing that's always most striking to me in this job is, the civil service workforce is so important to the delivery of big kind of political priorities, goals, and safeguarding the country. But because of the kind of understandable issues around impartiality and objectivity in the civil service code, it's a sort of slightly voiceless workforce. And we wanted to give officials the chance to talk about their workplaces, how they feel, what they think, and what's going on. The official civil service people survey, which I filled out many, many years in a row, it is really detailed, but is slightly soulless in the questions it asks and answers. They're all basically questions where if you answered the wrong way enough times, it still wouldn't be that embarrassing or frustrating to government. And I think if that's your metric, then it's not a very helpful survey. So we wanted to ask our own, and Susanna and the team have been really, really helpful in putting this together. I think what's most striking, that we had some really frustrating results that Grace has already kind of alluded to around talent and performance management, which was a big feature of our research last year. It's still the case that only 29% of the civil servants we surveyed said that the civil service takes talent and performance management seriously. 57% disagreed. Only 8% agreed with the statement. The civil service manages poor performance well, and 79% disagreed. And, many of these things are criticisms which the civil service most ardent critics outside it would also level. And it's tempting to get into these kind of us and them arguments about it. But actually, I know from experience and what we've been able to demonstrate with this survey is the majority, most civil servants also feel those things are true. So the us and them logic is kind of not very helpful at all. I think the thing that's most surprising to me from it is, generally speaking, results we asked about innovation and culture and, to the test and learn point, only 24% of civil servants said they felt they were encouraged and rewarded for trying to innovate in their jobs. Most civil servants on that question disagreed. But there are ways they were right. So 30% of officials said they were using AI in their jobs. That's way higher, I suspect, than DSIT would imagine it was. And it's quite uncomfortable because the majority of those are also using AI tools which aren't provided by the government. They're publicly provided. That's not in line with policy. So that's really tricky. But it shows an appetite to innovate and a willingness to use tools, but actually a frustration with the process and having to go around it. I think that's more and more typical of how government works at the moment. This sort of bureaucratic, process-led model is breaking down. So encourage people to take a look, and it's been a great bit of work to do.
I feel like we're on the one hand saying you can do a lot without having to change process and structures, and then on the other hand we're saying, but they're still frustrating, so we still need to try and work around them. I want to bring a little bit to the other I think sign of positive change, sign where will watch with interest, which is these mission test beds that have been announced. So those who are not at the Restate conference at which they were announced, or avid readers of Civil Service World newsletters, which you should all be, these are in the campuses in Darlington, Leeds and Sheffield. They are going to be turned into test beds for how can we drive the growth, health and opportunity missions, respectively, in a place-based way. So kind of using those campuses as a way to think about how do you work with local and regional government and business in that area. Grace, what did you think when you heard this announcement? Is it something you are pleased to hear?
Oh, definitely. I think it was really interesting hearing Georgia speak at your conference, Joe, about the kind of the ways in which those sites had kind of reproduced the silos of Whitehall departments and weren't actually turning out to the community and engaging with industry, business, civil society in those places. So I think this is a great move. I guess, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. I'll let Joe come in.
Let Joe come in and then you can try and find it again. Joe, what did you think? I mean, I guess one question is, again, as we said with Test and Learn, what do you think is going to be important to letting these have an impact?
Yeah, so there's a kind of process side to it and an outcome side to it. I think this is an area the government's making genuinely really good progress on, is sort of move of policy making outside of London, but also, using that to find new ways of doing policy and delivery, which are more distributed, less centralized, and more based on local partnership. As ever, I'm kind of interested in where's that not true? What are the challenges with that? Rory Stewart has possibly made one of the best cases of this in an interview he gave, I think over a year ago, about his time as Minister in the Foreign Office, where he said, well, we're trying to deal with global crises. We've moved half of the team to Scotland. They can't fly down for meetings because of our net zero targets. They have to get the train, and they can't organise trains for the next day because the price point is above what the commercial function will allow them to pay. And so, there are reasons why governments centralise large parts of policy-making expertise in their capital often, but I think we've gone way too far in this country, and there's plenty of room for us to go the other way. Whether it's a success, I think hinges on two things. One is either you kind of incubate really interesting initiatives in local areas, and central government working with partners finds ways to scale that up, or you say, no, we're committed to devolution as part of this. We think devolution is not helpful just on a principle based, but as I would argue, as a way of actually just getting better quality on average over time. And so we're not going to try and force national kind of scale up, roll out, but actually we're going to provide people the resources to do this locally. And, I speak to some of these teams fairly frequently, and their precursors in particular missions. And my sense is still large central government departments will show up to local areas and say, we actually want to do a pilot of this across these 20 areas, and here's your money, congratulations, and can you do it tomorrow, but also can you tell us how well it's going to go the day after? And that's another good example of where we're not really trying, right? We're trying to do devolution and place-based delivery on our terms and on the kind of requirements of central government. I think it's wrong.
I think that sort of touches on the point you made, Grace, around the five. If just dialing back to the 5 missions, it doesn't make sense for them all to have the same approach in terms of how they will work. And that kind of gets me thinking about, does it make sense, therefore, to have a central mission delivery unit, which would, is there to kind of oversee them? Or what is a good mechanism for being able to take good practice and scale it, share it without being too prescriptive? Because obviously, notwithstanding your points, Joe, we don't just want flowers to bloom and get no benefit elsewhere, even if the same flowers won't bloom across the country. So I was bringing you in, Grace, around any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it sort of applies to the previous conversation, but I think any mission delivery unit or central kind of function should be about learning, building communities of practice, unblocking issues, a sort of hub and spoke model, rather than oversight and assurance, pulling control to the centre. Absolutely can't be something that's seen as kind of sucking all the oxygen out of the exciting, glossy stuff, which disempowers civil servants across departments to be working in this way. So I think there is a role, given how much the kind of accountability for missions has kind of snapped back into the comfortable shape of departments. I think there is a role for something that sort of sits above that. I don't know whether that's sort of separate mission teams that are kind of outside of the departmental structure. I do think there's a need for kind of more strategic long-term capability at the centre somewhere. That's not rocket science. Governments of all stripes have needed strategic capability at different times, and I think that requires being able to turn outwards. We've talked lots about Georgia and the work she did in Camden. Equally important is Jenny, the outgoing chief exec at Camden Council, and very inspiring the work they did. That kind of whenever there was a crisis, whenever there was a difficulty, there is a temptation to kind of create a bunker mentality and turn inwards and look at processes and structures. Their approach in Camden, specifically Georgia and Jenny, was to turn outwards to the community, to get out into the world rather than kind of closing the doors and pulling down the blinds. And so I think that kind of mentality is applicable here in terms of facing challenge head on.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that kind of, we've mentioned it, and we don't want to become too, individualized here, but I think we've mentioned the importance of leadership. It is encouraging, obviously, that Georgia is in the Cabinet Office and is clearly driving. There are also others in there. Nick Kimber, an official in the Cabinet Office, who's also come from Camden and clearly very enthusiastic about this. We've got Kat doing the Civil Service COO role, and, she's again someone that we know is kind of dynamic and drives change. And I think that there are kind of, but we need those leaders to be able to work together. What you're saying, we need that kind of shared joint approach, and we are going to take the same approach to risk. We're going to take the same approach to experimentation. And I think that's also, I slightly worry what might happen if Georgia left the Cabinet Office. We've got some questions coming in around, we do need accountability and assurance around, we need to encourage experimentation. And there's also a question around needing a definite operating framework that kind of empowers you to innovate. So it's a kind of question there around, we do need some structures both to help us to innovate and to kind of give assurance around, I suppose it's reassuring people who don't like innovation that we are still keeping an eye on this and we are making this risk, we are managing the risk appropriately. Is that something you both kind of, do you recognize those fears, and what do you kind of think of it is the right way to put structures and process around innovation?
Very quick one from me, but defer to Jo. I think it goes back to the point about not everything is about missions and the risk of mission washing. We're talking quite specifically about experimentation around delivering up these missions, but that is not to say that is a mode of, there are definitely ways of making sure that there is rigor and accountability, but giving license for that slightly more creative way of working doesn't mean unleashing that across, every corner of Whitehall and dropping everything else that is extremely effective and important. So just a small point from me on that one.
I'm gonna interpret it liberally, because I just don't feel strongly about the kind of central mission delivery unit versus disaggregate versus I think this is an area where we reach for structures and org charts because that feels easy rather than because it really matters. I do want to talk about risk. I think risk is such a good word and it's really at the heart of this. Because I think you should have a really strange and asymmetric relationship with risk in government. When I joined the civil service, and the whole time I was there, I heard and would have said countless times, government is very risk averse. We have to take very risk averse approaches. It's one of these sort of policy memes that just sort of persists forever. I don't believe that's true, and I no longer say it. And government is clearly incredibly tolerant of risk. Every day you only have to read a newspaper or look at the performance of any public service, or look at the state of public finances or the long-term trajectory of government spending that the OBR published this week, to realize government is hugely tolerant of risk every single day. It's maybe not tolerant of some kinds of risk. The risk of kind of being the person who looks like they're trying to do something different. I guess where that's tricky is obviously government love, and senior officials love, announcing pilots all the time. And so if the risk is something to do with, or we're going to do something different, then actually we're incredibly comfortable with that as well. I think there are so many ways we could get into this, but I'll just say a kind of covering statement. I think the way we talk about and relate to risk in government is deeply unhealthy. And it's just not true. It's a way of distracting us from what really matters. Government takes big risks all the time. It should take a different set of big risks in my estimation, but pretending those things aren't the same kind of thing. I'll give you one really, or two really good examples. The government's trying to downsize the workforce at the moment, for good reasons, which we at the think tank support. The civil service workforce has grown massively since the start of the pandemic. it's trying to do those through what it sees as the least risk averse approach of voluntary exit schemes, rather than sustained focus on its workforce and saying, where are people not doing a very good job and how should we exit them? The Department for Transport over the last 6 years, according to our research, exited, I think, less than 0.02% of its workforce for poor performance. You can't tell me that that's at all reasonable. But that's an example of saying, well, the risk of getting rid of someone at an employment tribunal is a really big risk. So we can't take it. Obviously, the risk of retaining and paying people who are not very good at their jobs is a much bigger risk, but we don't treat those two things on paper. And the state is full of examples of this. We could litigate many more. I won't even do my second example. I think it's better just to leave it at that.
Just to completely agree with that, all you need to do is read through public inquiries to see the risk in the status, like maintaining the status quo. And so that there is a kind of, like, as Joe said, a different framing around risk that I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting research from the Protect, which is the whistleblower charity, where they did looked into the cost of not listening to people early enough in unfolding crisis. They looked at various inquiries and problems over the last few decades, and said if you had listened to people at this point, you could have saved a lot if you'd spotted and intervened on those problems rather than sticking with the status quo. You've mentioned the workforce, Joe. We've spoken a lot about what has changed or hasn't changed. I want to think about what needs to happen next. And we've begun to talk about capability, about other changes. We've got both a workforce strategy due later this year and a digital roadmap due later this year, which I think of as will be the kind of PDFs that tell us about what their reform agenda is really for the civil service and public services. Recognizing that a PDF is just something that goes on the document, on the website rather, what would you like to see in those change statements? What would you think the government should be leaning into in terms of workforce or technology or to drive change? Do you want to go first, Grace?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is striking to me on workforce is I think last year it was 83% of senior civil servants that left were marked as regrettable losses, meaning that they'd scored top talent markings in their latest appraisals. Like, that speaks to a wider issue across public services. Dan Honig's work has looked at how the most passionate social workers are the first to leave. So I think that kind of is quite a clarifying reminder of how do we keep the very best, who I'm sure are on this call, feeling passionate about their work and able to do good work. So I think that's sort of a lens I would want to, bring to that. On the digital side of things, I think what we haven't really seen from government is anything about local government. Most people will interact with digital services from national government a handful of times a year, and half of those will be to reset their password. So I think obviously DWP and NHS are probably the biggest exceptions to that. But from a kind of digital roadmap perspective, what's missing, we feel, from the government's plans is a vision for that kind of digital at local level. The local digital landscape is fragmented, it's uncoordinated, it's full of duplication that could be avoided and missed opportunities. We've talked about shared learning, missed opportunities for shared learning. We kind of think about this as the missing middle, and digital transformation needs to be addressed at that point. Otherwise, local government efforts will remain piecemeal and there will be a kind of widening gulf in service quality. I think that kind of local government ecosystem is something that feels missing from government plans.
Thanks, Grace. What about you, Joe? What do you want to see in those plans?
So I recently told the Science, Innovation and Tech Committee in Parliament that I just didn't want to see a tech plan at all. It was sort of counterintuitive, but there's obviously an exaggeration. I'm very happy to read the plan, and the same would be true on the workforce as well. But I want to not really answer the question, answer a different question, which is I believe the kind of constant production of government strategies on things particularly its own corporate business, the ones we're talking about, is like the worst kind of industrial policy, and is effectively a way of giving itself space and time to not do things, and to let officials and ministers have lots of meetings, produce lots of paper, spend lots of time editing each other's work, and in a sense not really actually grapple with the challenges. On both counts, I think I would be amazed if either strategy says something that I'm not expecting it to, and I'd be incredibly surprised if it doesn't, if either of them says anything new. That in itself is quite telling. And actually, unless they are willing to do radically different things, like Grace says, found a local government digital service and find a way to crowdfund it and some enterprise capabilities, or on the workforce, they are really willing to radically shift their policy on managed exits to one of kind of compulsory redundancies and a real grip of poor performance quickly, then they just shouldn't bother. They should focus on slightly optimizing the policies they already have, because I think generally ministers' officials say, we should probably have a strategy. They take 6 to 9 months writing it, sometimes longer. They discover they can't say anything new for the same old reasons. They publish it, and then in about a year's time, they decide they have to repeat the process again. And it's actually such an unhealthy thing for our kind of our state and our politics.
Thanks, Joe. I always rely on you to come with a provocative view, so thank you. We've got about 4 minutes, and I'm going to channel my kind of Melvin Bragg at the end of the podcast that he does, where he says, right, we finished the recording. What's the one thing you wish you could have said? So in the last 4 minutes, Grace and Joe, for your final remarks, what is one thing you want to make sure you tell our audience about this topic around mission-driven government, or the change in the last year? Grace, you've had a little chance to think while Joe was provoking us with his scrap strategy manifesto. What's one thing you want to make sure you say before we sign off for the
so many things. I would want to emphasise the importance that missions are about people and behaviours and culture much more than they're about structures and processes. We are really interested in continuing to understand, this is not a pitch, but understand the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of incentives, the barriers to working in this way, particularly when it comes to being able to collaborate across tiers of government and with civil society and business. And so that for me is the real kind of crunch point on delivery of missions, is it empowering everyone on this call and the wider civil service to work kind of in different ways. So I think that would be the main thing I say. I think that we've talked about it a bit on this call. There is a little bit of cynicism, of course, around missions. There always is about a kind of new potential jargon. It's kind of, I imagine, there's a self-selecting crowd on this call, so we're probably not talking to people who are fully cynical. I imagine people on this call are thinking, how do I persuade, or they might be a bit cynical, but how do I persuade my peers that this is actually something that, and the people that I work with, that this is something that matters? I think avoiding thinking of missions as a new glossy thing. It's happening already. It's happening in local authorities. It's happening in regional government. It's happening across Whitehall departments. As Joe said earlier, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's kind of a banner for thinking about lots of very sensible ideas around clarity, outcomes, kind of long-term vision. And I think a sort of tonic for that cynicism is getting out and getting into communities and seeing the innovation that is happening across the country in this mission-driven way already. The challenge, of course, as we talked about, is the join up and the communication channels. But I'm hopeful ultimately that we're much greater than the sum of our parts across tiers of government in terms of making this happen.
Thanks, Grace. Joe, what about you? What do you want to make sure you've said?
God, yeah. I think a final thought from me would be there's a lot of opportunity to getting this stuff right. There's a huge risk to not doing it at all. The refrain for most of the time I was a civil servant was that the problems with how well the state functioned were were everyone else's fault and were nothing to do with what civil servants ever did. And I know personally that's not true, because plenty of things that I did didn't go very well, and it was my fault. And lots of this is driven by the systems and structures and incentives that people work in. But that public service reform narrative is really crucial to delivering missions and turning into something. It's not going to work anymore to say, well, the problem is the Treasury's fiscal rules, the problem is that we all can't just collaborate and be friends, or the problem is this kind of, all of these structural things. Sometimes the problem is, it is endemic to the way that people decide to go to their job and do it. And the really long-term, well, not long-term, quite near-term risk here is that, which civil service leaders really have to think about. Public faith in institutions is at an all-time low. The civil service is no exception in that. The body politic at large is kind of breaking down, and we're seeing the emergence of fringe political parties actually on all sides. There is a kind of existential risk to the civil service as it exists today. On the other side of the Atlantic, a very different administration is embarking on quite a radical experiment of how to reshape the state, and it's going quite badly in many ways. But at some point, if we can't fix endemic problems to do with how the state works, then a political party in this country will be given the same opportunity, and they will have basically no sense of friendship or affinity to institutions like the civil service that have worked for us. So there's the civil service is an apolitical organization, but exists in a very political world. And for the leaders of the civil service, this kind of could get very existential very quickly.
Thanks, guys. I think that's both final remarks which give us both a kind of sense of urgency, a sense of importance of leaning into its people and culture. It's the people on this call and the people you work with who are going to drive this change. And hopefully through the course of the discussion, we've given you some things to think about, some examples that are good and others to learn from. And we will continue at Civil Service World, at Future Governance Forum, at Restate, to be looking at how we make government better and talking about things that are going well and things that we can learn from. So please do continue to follow our newsletter, follow Restate and Future Governance Forum. Thank you for joining us, and I hope the rest